Hello, and welcome to Dark Hearts with Stacy Lee. I'm happy you're here today, and it's Cult Day here on Dark Hearts. I have one of the darkest stories I have ever told for you today. With the rise of a certain type of disturbing thinking taking place, coming from people like Elon Musk, I thought it was appropriate to put out a reminder in the form of a story of the horrors committed during and after World War II. We must never forget what happened and why this type of thinking must never be allowed to rise again. I hope today's story serves as a reminder as to how evil people can be when they are led by an evil man who makes them believe the worst version of themselves is acceptable. It never will be, and we outnumber those who believe it is thousands to one. We talk about a lot of wackiness and just pure stupidity when we discuss cults, but this story is different. To this day, we do not know how many people were tortured and murdered inside this cult because the Chilean dictator was using the compound as a secret and illegal murder machine for anyone who opposed him. I had to do a lot of translating for this episode, and it's a story that needs more coverage here in the States. This is the horrifying story of the Colonia Dignidad cult. I'm your host, Stacy Lee. Let's begin. This is a complex story with a lot of nuance. We could spend hours talking about Nazi Germany, the people who willingly participated in horrific acts against humanity, and all of the terrible things that occurred in that dark era. We all know this. What I don't think we discuss enough are some of the things those willing participants went on to do after the war, and that's what we're focused on today. This is Paul Schäfer. He was born in 1921 in Germany. As a child, he was struck in the eye with a fork, resulting in the loss of that eye. During World War II, he worked at a field hospital carrying wounded soldiers on stretchers, but he told people that he lost his eye as a result of a war wound. So already we have someone who is telling lies to make himself seem more courageous than he was. After the war, Paul Schäfer became an evangelical minister in the Evangelical Free Church, but he was removed from his position after rumors began to circulate that he was molesting young boys. What? Church leaders abusing children? I've never heard of that before. During the 1950s, Paul became a follower and promoter of the teachings of this man, William M. Branham, an American preacher who was an influence on Jim Jones. So that pretty much says all we need to know right there. What were Branham's teachings? Brace yourself because you've never, ever heard this before. Strict adherence to the Bible, a woman's duty to obey her husband, and of course, he had apocalyptic visions. What's a crazy-ass preacher without apocalyptic visions? You can't get people to follow you if you don't give them something to be afraid of. In 1955, Branham made a visit to Germany, and Paul Schäfer and other German evangelicals served as Branham's personal security duty on that visit. Paul Schäfer was obsessed with the idea of racial purity from the time he was a teenager. We don't say racial purity, we say white supremacy, full stop. During Branham's visit in Germany, he made a sermon. In that sermon, he said, all illnesses and all sin are actually demons entrenched in people's bodies. So we're 2 minutes into this and we've already gone over the edge. Launched off the earth into insanity. For years, Paul Schäfer followed William Branham's teachings, and by 1952, he gathered a number of his own followers and set up a children's home and orphanage in East Prussia, which is now divided into Poland, Lithuania, and Russia. Around 1959, Paul Schäfer was introduced to the Chilean ambassador to Germany, who invited him to Chile. Paul Schäfer then turns up in Chile in 1961, and he meets President Jorge Alessandri, who granted Paul permission to create the Dignidad Beneficent Society on a farm outside of Parral. Paul Schäfer was basically given a 4,400-acre ranch because the president was very religious, and Paul claimed to speak with God. that wall that they talk about building, the wall needs to be between church and state. That's the only wall I care about anymore. There was a terrible earthquake in Chile in 1950, and the country was rebuilding. Paul said he could help. He and 10 of his followers began preparing the farm for his new congregation. He didn't pay for this land. It was gifted to him. In 1963, 230 members of Paul's new congregation arrived from Germany in Chile. An additional 15 German families immigrated between 1966 and 1973. I don't know how Paul was going back and forth between Chile and Germany to keep recruiting members, but he was growing his following. William Branham was preaching that nuclear war was imminent and would devastate all Western countries. This fear tactic was used to persuade people to move to Chile. As soon as the majority of Paul's group was in Chile, Paul Schäfer began instituting his rules. You guys, we're just at the beginning. First, he separated all children from their parents, keeping the children in what he called a children's house, stating that parents are responsible for the sins of their children. And by separating them, he was protecting the children from their parents. No red flags here. Perfectly normal. Oh, and also, sin isn't real. The concept of sin is completely man-made and has absolutely nothing to do with morality, only with religion. And because all religion is also man-made, sin is based in nothing more than men's thoughts and ideas. We need to get away from the idea that religious people are more moral than non-religious people, because that is the furthest thing from the truth. Of course, there are religious people with good morals. Of course there are. But being religious does not mean you're moral. And it certainly doesn't mean you're more moral than non-religious people. Sin is described as God's law. It involves obedience and loyalty. Morality is a belief that you must behave in a way that is right and good, regardless of any dogmatic belief. I am not a religious person. I try very hard to be a moral person. I haven't always, but I'm trying now. Paul Schäfer is then injured in some type of hunting accident. From what I was able to find, the guy shot himself. When he got back from the hospital, he was different, more crazy. He forbade all festivities and celebrations. The people were no longer allowed to have joy because, happy people are much harder to control than sad people. There are also reports that at one of the festivals, a girl was caught dancing with a boy. So from that day forward, there was no more dancing. Some of the girls began a secret orchestra. Apparently, they had access to instruments. One night, as they were practicing in a barn, Paul Schäfer heard them and he walked in. The girls were terrified, but they showed Schäfer that some of the songs they knew were religious. And so Paul decided that they would be allowed to continue with the orchestra with him at the helm. He would now be the leader of the group. Whenever an outsider was allowed to visit the compound, Paul would present the orchestra for a performance. He wanted everything to look organized and peaceful, and he wanted to believe the children were being well educated. The reality was the children were not even in school. They were fed and they were watched, but no real education was taking place. And what little education was instituted was heavily monitored. Control, control, control. That's what cults are all about. The cult members were very rapidly experiencing more and more control over what they wore, how they spoke, what jobs they were permitted or forced to do. Even what they ate was controlled. And then the administration in Chile changed. Salvador Allende was put into power in Chile. Allende was not a far-right religious person like Alessandri was, and Paul Schäfer was afraid that new policies would hurt his cult. His response was to lock it down. Paul Schäfer became obsessed with arming all members of the cult, convinced they were going to be attacked. Paul Schäfer began smuggling weapons in from Germany. He was convinced that they were going to, be under some kind of attack. Because, his group is just so special out there, all 300 of them. I don't think anybody could have cared less in the beginning. But then Allende was overthrown and ended his own life with the resistance at his office door. A man named Augusto Pinochet was put into power, and Paul Schäfer turned the cult property into a compound. Pinochet was also right-wing and fascist. People at the compound were no longer free to leave, and this is where the true horror begins. Paul Schäfer built a wall in the complex. Those who had built houses on the land were forced to turn in their IDs at the reception center before they were able to come and go from their own houses. There was a wall between the residences and the inner compound. Paul knew these people would not try and leave the compound if they didn't have their IDs. There were those who wanted to leave, but they didn't dare. One woman would say many years later, "We knew this man was a pathological liar, but he was a Pied Piper, and they went like sheep to the slaughter." Allegations against Paul Schäfer begin to circulate among the members of the cult. They discover that Paul is wanted in Europe, and he tells his cult followers that he cannot return to Germany. Paul was convicted for assaulting 2 children in Germany in 1961, just before he turned up in Chile. This is why he left Germany, but he tells his followers that his exile from Germany is because of things that happened in the war. Now, he's a big fat pedo, like a lot of these guys are. That's why he was kicked out of Germany, wanted in Germany. To the outside world, this colony was praised as an example of German efficiency, cleanliness, and communal work. Local Chileans wondered why this German man, had set up on what he claimed to be a farm, knowing that the soil in that area was terrible for growing crops. It was a big piece of land that nobody else wanted because it had bad soil. That's part of the reason the government was willing to give it away to Paul, and he promised to assist them. The cult did manage to plant some things that grew, and regular services were held, church services. The religious services were about what you'd expect, but there was also a lot of choir concerts and plays. And Paul Schäfer always made himself the star. This is just so pathetic and very much reminds me of some people I know here in town. Have to be a little bit careful. I had a dealing with them involving my dance school, and then they made themselves the star of the kids were always in the background, and these 2 teachers were always putting themselves out front and center, using the school as a vehicle to perform because they couldn't cut it themselves as performers. And I bet you will be shocked to hear this. They were also into Impact. I need to cover Impact. Do you guys know what Impact is? It comes out of Provo, Utah, and it is one of the craziest cults. They say it's an MLM. It's a cult. If you want to hear about Impact, let me know. But anyway, Paul loved to be the star of these performances, and he also liked anything that gave him proximity to the children. Are you getting the vibe here? The parents had very little contact with their children at this point. These children were being raised by Paul's appointees. This was another method of control. The parents couldn't leave the cult because they didn't have access to their own kids. How anyone would allow that, I do not understand, but I don't understand most of what goes on. Paul told the parents that this separation was necessary so adults could focus on building the dining halls and workshops, work in the fields, and build houses. This man, Paul Schäfer, had basically gone into a foreign country and convinced them to give him a free giant plot of land where he built his own little kingdom, where he was the king. I would certainly hope that something like this could not happen today, but I know better than to hope that. A young German teenager living in the colony named Wolfgang Nies begins to have very serious doubts about what is happening in the colony. He has a difficult time talking about this now as an adult, but he tells a story about Paul Schäfer coming to the boys' barracks at night and basically forcing the teenaged boys into an orgy. Paul notices one night that Wolfgang Nies is not participating, and he asks him why. And Wolfgang said, "Because I don't want to." This put a target on his back. Wolfgang had a young woman he was attracted to, and one day, get this, they were caught looking at each other. Wolfgang was taken to the basement, beaten with a wooden rod, and drugged. One night, he flees from the colony, and he is taken in by a Chilean family who offers him sanctuary. Somehow, the police find Wolfgang, and he is taken before a judge who tells the courtroom, well, the colony is willing to take this young man back, even after he escaped and told these terrible stories about what happens there. And if they're willing to take him back after that, that must mean they're good people. What? What? So poor Wolfgang is placed back in the community, and his life became a living hell. He was beaten every day. The leaders carved a symbol into the bottom of his shoes so they could track his footprints. He was forced to wear all red during the day and all white at night, so he was always easily visible. And when he was let out of his jail cell, 2 guards were always with him. Now, everything I found on this cult, with the exception of a Wikipedia page, is in German. So I had to do a lot of translation. Like I said earlier, there are reports of another young man named Wolfgang Müller who fled the cult in 1966 and exposed the atrocities that were happening inside Colonia Dignidad. Well, I found out later on that Wolfgang Müller and Wolfgang Nies are the same person. He changed his name after leaving the cult. But when he was out and free on the streets of Chile and living with this family, he told people he tried to expose what was going on at the cult. He said, "They've taken us away from our parents. We're not allowed to see them at all. Our parents work all day and all night. They don't get any breaks." Nothing was done. By the end of 1966, 3 additional young men had escaped and then been returned to the cult in the same manner. So it's not like people did not try to warn others as to what was going on here. They weren't listened to. Paul Schäfer then sends word to social workers in Chile. He has decided that the cult is going to begin adopting Chilean orphans. Does this sound familiar? Gaza, the French Riviera. We don't let foreigners go into other people's lands and then start making up rules for the people that live there. Now, you have to remember, the cult was made up of Germans who had gone to Chile to join the cult there. There were no Chileans in the cult at that time. Paul Schäfer felt that by adopting orphans, it gave him a better image in Chile. And also, let's be honest, more workers to abuse and work to death and more victims to victimize. I'm sure there was also a notion that having Chilean citizens inside the cult would give him, more roots there. He wasn't trying to help Chilean orphans. He was trying to help himself. At this point, the members had built their own internal and external power sources. They had an 80-bed hospital run by a cult member that Paul Schäfer had allowed to attend medical school so he could become the cult's doctor. They even had a small airport with an airplane. They had modern farming equipment, and one member used his own money to buy a commercial rock crusher. The cult then began exporting gravel as a source of income. But most importantly, the cult members were forced to build a sturdy barbed wire fence around the compound. No one was allowed to come in, and no one was allowed to leave. This was a prison. Underneath one of the buildings, this building here called the Potato Cellar, they constructed what was basically a dungeon. This was the place used to punish any cult member that stepped out of line. One woman would later recall working in the Potato Cellar listening to screaming. She didn't dare say anything because she didn't want to end up down there. It's horrific, and there is no doubt that the Chilean government at the time is complicit in allowing these atrocities to continue. In 1970, Paul develops a close relationship with the new dictator, Augusto Pinochet, and behind closed doors, the two develop a horrible plan. Paul offers to Pinochet the colony to be used as a secret detention center. Paul assures the dictator that he would torture and then assassinate Chilean citizens at Pinochet's discretion. The compound becomes not only a pedophile paradise, as the press would later call it, but a secret illegal murder factory. Paul Schäfer was personally involved not only in the killing of illegal prisoners, but also in the burning of their bodies and destruction of their bones, most likely via the commercial rock crusher owned by the cult. So we've got illegal adoptions of children, abuse of children, sexual abuse of children, illegal detention of Chilean citizens, and murder going on. Yeah, if it weren't so well documented by people who actually participated, it would be difficult to believe. Many cults commit criminal acts, but rarely do we see a cult that is participating in mass murder. Paul Schäfer was a tyrant who used the most sadistic tactics to control his community, and that makes him responsible for the colony's crimes. Later on, 3 of Paul's most trusted and devoted members, Kurt Schnellenkamp, Gerhard Muck, and Karl Vanderberg, would state that they had little choice but to comply with Paul Schäfer's commands. They said he had our children locked up and we were watched 24 hours a day. Now, I have a problem with this. There were 3 of them and only 1 of Paul. They also had access to guns. Had they truly wanted to escape, to stop the torture and the murder, they had those guns. They could have at any time overpowered Paul Schäfer, killed him, locked him in the dungeon. And I think this is such a strong testament to the power of psychological control and warfare. These people were physically able to overpower and leave, at least these three men, but even when they could, they did not. That's how brainwashed they were. Now, there's a documentary on this cult, which is called A Sinister Sect, Colonia Dignidad. And when I watched it, I was disappointed to see it sweep under the rug too quickly for me, the relationship between Paul Schäfer and Nazism. Not only Paul Schäfer, but others as well. There is no way to separate the ideas of Nazism from the ideas at Colonia Dignidad. Schnellenkamp, Muke, and Vanderberg believed that they were the new generation of Nazis. They were nationalists, they were white supremacists, and I don't believe at all that they were not in on this madness. Paul Schäfer was a raging racist, and these men shared his views. How did a former Nazi, German expat acquire such power in a foreign country? It happened because he cozied up to people in power who shared his beliefs. This is exactly what's happening today. Exactly. This is the reason I chose this story. This person, Paul Schäfer, could not have risen to power had he not been given that power by the leader of the country, Jorge Alessandri, and by his ambassador to Germany, a man named Arturo Moschk. They were fascists. Allende didn't last long as leader, and then Pinochet was in power, and he was most definitely sharing a brain with Paul Schäfer. So Paul Schäfer is allowed to continue with this unbelievable, highly illegal behavior for years. The West German government was receiving letters from the relatives of those living in the cult saying that their family members were being held against their will. The West German ambassador in Santiago made some feeble attempts to interview the cult members named in those letters, but no serious effort was ever made to determine whether or not there was illegal activity taking place in the cult, which was, for all intents and purposes, a concentration camp. People were being worked 7 days a week, 12 to 14 hours a day. They were being fed nothing but bread and potatoes, and they were starving. They were constantly watched by cult members who had been designated with the title of supervisor. They were basically prison guards. These supervisors were always armed and always watching. Not only were the cult members monitored by armed guards, there was a pack of specially trained German Shepherd dogs who accompanied each supervisor, and the members of the cult were terrified of these dogs. They had been trained to be vicious and dangerous, and the dogs could obviously outrun anyone who tried to flee, so it never happened. In 1975, Amnesty International published a 60-page pamphlet entitled Colonia Dignidad, German Model Farm in Chile, Torture Center of the DINA. DINA is the acronym for Dirección de Inteligencia Nacional, the National Intelligence Dictatorate. This was a group of secret police in Chile during the dictatorship of Augusto Pinochet. These horrors went unchecked for a decade. We will never know the full scope of the atrocities that were committed on this compound. It's impossible to know because the groups were separated and had no contact with each other. And some of the cult members have never left. Some of them remained, and others simply disappeared. After 17 years of dictatorship, Chile's government turned to a democracy, but Colonia Dignidad remained unchanged. More allegations of humiliation, torture, and abuse came from the cult. National and international organizations became involved, and the pressure to disband the cult intensified. When police were sent to the cult to investigate allegations, they were met with a wall of silence. Paul Schäfer's reach was so deep inside the government that he would get phone calls warning him when the police were headed to the compound. But slowly, outside views on the cult were beginning to change. Chileans began to grow a feeling of resentment towards these foreigners who had so much overreach in their country. The cult was viewed as encroaching into Chilean territory, and the government and citizens alike were not happy about it. On top of that, there were rumors of abuse and child molestation coming from family members of the cult members. By this time, the compound had 2 apartment complexes, 2 schools, several meeting houses, a machine shop, a bakery, numerous animal stables, an airplane and an air landing strip, a hydroelectric power station, and all kinds of wood mills and factories. The cult made all of its own clothing and uniforms, including costumes for the plays and productions it put on. And then there was, of course, the hospital, where cult members provided free medical care to thousands of Chilean patients from one of the country's poorest areas. The hospital was really the thing that kept authorities at bay. This cult was providing a service to the government that it did not want to pay for poor people. And then it was helping the dictator murder people. So, they had a lot of freedom. Only German was spoken inside the colony, no Spanish, because Paul Schäfer did not speak Spanish. As he aged, he grew more serious, more tyrannical. He rarely smiled. And here's something I find interesting. Paul allowed a cult member to become a cameraman and videographer, documenting the things that Paul wanted documented inside the cult. But Paul himself rarely allowed himself to be photographed or videoed. You have to remember, he was wanted in Germany, so that probably had something to do with it as well. And this is why when we see the images from inside, they are mostly of workers at their jobs or of children putting on plays and concerts, eating in the dining hall, and getting medical care. That is what Paul Schäfer wanted shown. The access to guns was then limited to Paul Schäfer's most trusted followers only. It would later come out that children were not just being sexually abused. They were being forced to undergo shock treatment therapy, and they were heavily drugged using sedatives. It's unbelievable. It's all true. As children turned into young adults, Paul Schäfer was the sole decider when it came to courtship and marriage. When couples were allowed to marry, Paul Schäfer chose who would marry each other based not on genetics, but solely on their loyalty to him. He identified himself as the permanent uncle to all children born inside the cult. Yeah, he's the permanent creepy uncle. When children were born of these marriages, the babies were raised by nurses in groups segregated by their sex. Their parents were not allowed to raise their own babies, which is something I cannot wrap my head around. Nobody is taking my baby from me. How anyone could tolerate this is completely beyond me. When the children turned 6, they were placed in a group called the Army of Salvation. When they turned 15, they entered a group called the Elder Servants. Females were divided into groups called the Dragons or the Field Mice. Older women were called the grannies. Cult members lived 6 people to 1 room and always dressed in 1930s style German clothing. 12-hour work days, 7 days a week were the norm, and no one was ever paid. They had no money, they were isolated in a foreign country, and they were too far from civilization to think about running, even if there was ever a break from the heavily monitored activities. And then on top of that, how were they going to get their kids out? In 1991, Chile's National Commission for Truth and Reconciliation concluded that many people had been apprehended by DINA, the dictator's secret service police, and held at Colonia Dignidad before being tortured and murdered. To date, there are more than 1,100 people gone missing during this period of time in Chile. Some of them were professors and patriots who opposed Pinochet. Others were hikers who went on hiking trips and never went home. By the mid-2000s, cries for justice were too loud to be ignored. In June and July of 2005, Chilean police stormed the compound and found 3 containers of machine guns, automatic rifles, rocket launchers, and ammunition. Some of these weapons were 40 years old, but they showed evidence of recent use and maintenance. Also in 2005, a man named Michael Townley, by then living in the United States under witness protection, came forward and gave proof of Interpol Chile links to DINA and Colonia Dignidad. He had proof that Colonia Dignidad was working with the secret police and the dictator. He then turned over proof that Paul Schäfer was working with a chemist named Eugenio Barrios to create biological warfare weapons. It's terrifying. It's absolutely terrifying. And this stuff is still going on all over the world. There are groups everywhere engaged in this type of behavior, and it's terrifying. There were even allegations that Joseph Mengele, the infamous Nazi doctor known as the Angel of Death, was hiding out at Colonia Dignidad. Whether that is true or not, I don't know. In 2004, a Chilean court brought formal charges against Paul Schäfer, and he was arrested along with 26 other cult members. The allegations were those related to child abuse. Paul Schäfer was put on trial, and in 2006, he was sentenced to 20 years in prison. He died just 4 years later while in prison. He was 88 years old. In 2011, a man named Helmut Hopp, Paul Schäfer's right-hand man, was placed on house arrest in Chile while awaiting trial for human rights crimes. In May of 2011, he fled Chile on a helicopter and made his way back to Germany. In June of 2016, German prosecutors petitioned a court to enforce a 5-year sentence that Hopp had been sentenced to in absentia in Chile. It never happened. This man was not arrested. 16 Chilean and German members of the cult were sentenced to prison. Some of them ended up getting only probation on appeal. A team of coordinators took over the colony, tasked with reintegrating all cult members back into Chilean society. They were allowed to remain at the colony and continue living there if they wanted. All of the facilities were turned into wellness industry businesses like organic yogurt production and clothing production. Most colonists have now left, and the compound is called Villa Baviera. Some do remain in Chile, and others have returned to Germany and Austria. They never received a formal education, and so now, at retirement age, they are living on minimal pensions and they are unable to work. The scars of their life in the cult will never fade, but at least they have their lives. The same cannot be said for anyone who opposed the evil man that Paul Schäfer was, and we will never know the true toll of the horrific acts he committed at Colonia Dignidad. Not a very fun story today, but I think a very timely and important one. Thank you for joining me today on Dark Hearts with Stacy Lee. I really appreciate you, and I want to give a special thank you to my patrons. You know, I've got 2 podcasts. This one's called Dining with Death. This one's called Dark Hearts with Stacy Lee. I post new episodes of this one every Monday and every Wednesday. Both podcasts are on Apple, Spotify, and Amazon. We're still working on a fundraiser. Watch this short video if you would like to donate a few dollars to possibly help our community solve some cold crimes. All of the details are in the video. I sure appreciate you spending a little bit of your day with me. Stay safe, my friends, and be kind to each other. And I will see you next time on Dark Hearts with Stacy Lee. Bye.